Hello and welcome back to the latest Penumbra Tower devlog. Penumbra Tower is a grid-based roguelike where the player explores the floors of the tower, killing enemies, and finding items to help with the journey. Before we get into the item system updates, I'm going to quickly cover some general changes that I've made. So this is the thumbnail from the second devlog. The thumbnail itself doesn't matter, but something has been bothering me about the frog sprite for a while now. Look into his eyes. What do you see in there? Look into his eyes. So anyway, I've gone ahead and updated the player sprite to make it look like it hasn't had a lobotomy. I think it turned out pretty well. Okay, so moving on, I've gone ahead and updated the UI once again. This is what it looked like in the previous devlog. Essentially, it just had the health, actions, and damage values listed out, and there was this whole thing with the item placeholders, but we'll get to that later. And here's the updated version. Rather than just displaying total health as a number, I thought it would be nice if there was a health bar to look at, but, pretty basic. I've also used these diamonds to indicate the current amount of actions the player has. I'm not super happy with these right now, kind of thinking about transitioning these to a bar as well. I've also expanded the base damage breakdown, so now it shows the total damage output as well as the breakdown of the base damage and the damage multiplier. I thought this would be useful with the addition of the damage modifier items, but this will make more sense once we talk about the item changes. I also went ahead and included some placeholders for other potential stat modifiers like crit rate, burning, and poison damage. I also prettied up the item card as well. It even has a current stat counter, but more on that later. I decided that there are too many UI elements that could be shown in the enemy overhead UI. And because of this, I've moved the enemy UI to the right side of the screen, which will appear depending on which enemy the player is hovering over. It shows roughly the same information that the player UI displays. I might change it to show slightly less, mainly because enemies won't have access to every stat that the player does. The main reason why I did this, as I said, it allows me to display way more information without covering anything in the room, which will be very useful for when things like the status effects get added in. Plus, the right side of the screen was looking a little empty. And as for how I implemented these UIs, I have a prefab for the player's UI and created a prefab variant for the enemies and simply removed any information that wasn't needed, like items or other stats. These UI canvases are added directly to the player and enemy prefab objects. That way, if I create a new enemy variant in the future, it will automatically have a working UI connected to it. Moving away from the player and enemy UI for a second, the gameplay loop is now properly functioning. Players can now generate the next floor by going through the door once it's unlocked by killing all the enemies. Each floor is still randomly generated. I also created this transition screen that appears when the player leaves the floor, and it gives a little bit of information about the next floor. As you may have noticed, player and enemy stats have been adjusted to accommodate the item scaling. Previously, enemies started with 5 HP, and both the player and enemies started with 1 damage. Player and enemies now start with 5 base damage and more health. I did this because I wanted the lowest attack multiplier to be 20%, and I didn't want any funny business happening with decimals, so the lowest I could go was 5.
Look, the best I could do is maybe a $19 Fortnite card, and I'll even throw in a Travis Scott McNugget meal, all right? Do we have a deal?
So before I start explaining how I've altered the item system, we need to first talk about the UI, because it's easier to explain with the visual aid. In the previous devlog, I had a very rough prototype of how items get applied to the player, which was by clicking them on the left side of the screen. The last couple weeks, I've been very focused on creating a simple and smooth experience for finding and selecting items. So take a look at this item screen I made the cards myself in Krita, and yes, I did forget to record it again. Previously, I had started working on adding an item system into the game. Back then, this system added a flat bonus to the player's stats, so how it worked was when the players started with 1 damage, they would pick up an item, and that item would give them an additional +1 damage, making their total damage 2. I decided that this probably wasn't going to scale well, so I've adjusted the values to be percentage increases instead. So I'll give you an example here. Let's say I want this toxic toadstool item. It has a damage multiplier of 40% and a max health multiplier of 10%. When I select this item, the player's total damage increases from 5 to 7, because an additional 40% damage is being added to the 5 base damage, thus increasing our total physical damage by 2. And you might be asking yourself, but why differentiate between base damage and total damage? This is because of the way item scaling is going to work. Let's take a look at another item. The Vial of Blood gives the player 20% lifesteal when they attack an enemy. But 20% of what? This 20% is actually being calculated from the base damage and not the total damage. This is because if we use total damage for this, the best option would be to take one lifesteal item and just stack a whole bunch of damage to scale the 20% off of. So how do you scale something like lifesteal then? Well, I've already hinted at it earlier in the video. If you want to run a build that focuses on a stat like lifesteal, for example, you can stack multiple of the same item. So if I've picked up 3 vials of blood, I've increased my lifesteal to 3, because it's taking a total of 60% of my base damage, which is 5. And just a side note here, there will be more item variants with slightly different variations of the same effect later on. So maybe 2 or 3 lifesteal items that are slightly different. It won't just be vials of blood. And just a side note to the side note, I've shown you a couple of items that provide a stat multiplier to some base stats, but there will also be items that do slightly increase some stats like base damage. However, they will be more rare than other items because of their more holistic implications. So how do you find items? Well, the original plan was to have the user just select an item when they travel to the next floor. But I thought about it a bit, and thought it would be cool to have a chest object instantiated on a random tile in the room. I could talk about the added choice of letting the player decide to either open the chest in the middle of a fight or after everything is dead, or maybe deciding if it's worth it to step on a hazardous tile to get the chest. These choices make the game more interesting, but really it came down to me just wanting to create a chest sprite. And yes, I forgot to record making the chest. Moving more towards code here for a second, I've also adjusted the abstract class for items to be more flexible than it was in the previous devlog. Back then, when creating a new item, I would have needed to create a new class every time, but now there's a single class that accounts for all the base stat adjustments, and now I only need to create a new class if the item has a unique ability, like the lifesteal item for example. Sorry, I'm going to flashbang you guys here. Let's talk about my plan for items. And if you have any ideas for items that you think would be interesting, leave a comment and let me know. I think it's best to explain the items by breaking them up into groups. So, base stat items are items that adjust the values of the player, like the toxic toadstool that was shown earlier. Additional functionality items are items that add unique modifiers to the unit. The Vial of Blood would fall into this category. And finally, ability equipment. I haven't implemented these items yet, but the current plan for the ability equipment is the player can only hold a single ability item. Because of how unique these items are, the best example of this that I could give is, think of it as a weapon in a weapon slot. For example, shooting a projectile, or teleporting to the opposite side of the room, or maybe doubling the player's attack range. The main purpose of like the ability equipment item is it would vastly alter the way the game would be played. So that's my plan for future items, or at least my current plan. I'm going to work on adding a whole bunch more items, as I think right now there are maybe only 5 to 6 items currently in the game. What I'm going to do now is just play through the gameplay loop. This is probably going to be the most candid view of the game you guys have seen so far, but I think it's good to show the culmination of everything that's been worked on at this point. So I'm just here in the room. The chest spawned practically right beside me, so I'm just definitely going to click it. Fresh Heart is an item I haven't shown you guys yet. Pretty much it's the equivalent of a healing per second item, but because this is a turn-based game, I could just stand here forever and just keep healing. So what it's doing instead is healing per action taken. It's quite similar to the Blood Vial item in terms of lifesteal, but instead of just on attacks, it's also when you move. But I took the sword instead, and the sword is 60% attack multiplier. It's the highest attack multiplier out of all the items I've added in so far. So we're doing 8 damage per hit. Gonna attack this rat once and then get out of the way. And he's dead. Okay, so we cleared the floor. I don't know. I don't think I mentioned this either. I have like a skull pile here now. It's pretty nice looking. You can destroy it. Replace the rocks. I feel like it fit in more with the theme of the dungeon, you know. So it looks like we got a rat and a pikeman. They both have 2 actions each. But we do a lot of damage right now, so that guy's dead. Gonna come up here, hit the pikeman. He's gonna hit me once. I'm gonna kill him. See what's in the chest this time. I'm gonna pick the vial of blood because we're almost dead already. Only have 15 health left. I'm gonna go for the item right away. Hope it's another vial of blood. Okay, we're not so lucky. I'm gonna pick the toxic toadstool just so we do a lot of damage. Okay. We're now healing. Oh no, we're still healing 1. For some reason I thought we actually did get a second vial. Okay, rat and a skirmisher. Gotta go for the item again. I'm gonna take another sword. And we're doing 13 damage now, so at this point, you're gonna start to see a problem. The fact that we're doing a total of 13 damage, it's 5 base damage, plus a 160% multiplier. We're essentially 2-shotting all the mobs at this point, so we can kill them in less than 1 turn, because we're doing 3 actions a turn. And the issue is that there is no enemy scaling at this point in the game. Well, I just killed myself there because I wasn't paying attention, but yeah, so the player can essentially infinitely scale as long as you stay alive long enough or get enough healing items, and you'll just keep getting stronger. But I haven't implemented any enemy scaling. I think it'll be fairly simple. I think balancing it will probably take some work, but the actual implementation should be okay, I imagine. But yeah, that's the gameplay loop. We made it to floor 3 or 4. I wasn't really paying attention. I could have made it a lot farther if I was actually trying, but I kind of just walked into a whole bunch of attacks. But yeah, that's the gameplay loop. It's still missing so much, but it's what's there so far. Anyways, thanks for watching, and subscribe to the channel if you want to follow the progress.